I've definitely drunk too much coffee today, but it's okay because we are doing an absolute banger of a masterclass, and it's how to stop or completely eliminate downward spirals from happening. And if there isn't enough, you also unlock your ideal safe at the same time. And how we're going to do this is by cultivating unconditional love, and this is going to be your masterclass on it. So the table of contents are labeled the magic pill, the magic behind the pill, my trials and tribulations, please learn from my mistakes, cultivating your own inner fire, your own inner strength, healing and rewiring shadows that limit our potential, the mechanics and pitfalls, that's very important, to avoid behind holding compassion for yourself. So we're not just talking about holding compassion, but we're actually going to get into the mechanics of what compassion is and how we can hold it for ourselves in an effective and pragmatic way where we don't also let go of boundaries, and fast tracking your progress on this journey. And then there'll be action protocols that we're going to get into. So what we're going to start off with is the closest thing to a magic pill that there is. And I don't say this lightly. I know there's a lot of sensationalist claims out there where they claim one thing and then you actually kind of do the thing and it doesn't really get you what you want. Or if it does, it kind of gets you it in a very lukewarm matter. But when this is properly implemented, you can't downward spiral. And the reason for that, I'm not just saying that for no reason, like I said, the reason for that is because when you downward spiral is essentially, or downward spirals are essentially reactions to what has happened to us. So there's the actual event of what has happened to us. Let's say we get teased for our appearance, for example. Well, there's the incident which we don't have any control over, because you don't have any control over the world or how other people act. You barely have control over yourself, so you can't expect that from the world or from other people. And when this happens, we have one of two options for simplicity's sake. We either just get over it, or we say, you know what, they're right, and I should have changed my hair today, or I should have gone to the gym. I haven't been going to the gym, and I know I've been slacking off. Right? So that's the first thing that happens. Then the second thing that happens is we judge ourselves for that judgment that we just made. Oh yes, and then because of that, and the reason why I'm like that is because I've always been lazy. My teacher was right when I was a kid. And it happens again, and it happens again, and it happens again. That's why it's called a downward spiral. At each downward stage, you can almost say, there's one thing which is going to either make something work. It's make or break, basically. It's like you can either stop and then go back up, or you can just keep on going down. Now, the reason why downward spirals are such a big problem is because once you go through the first loop, so to say, it becomes easier and easier and easier to spin downward, downward, downward. And the deeper you spin, the harder it seems to get out. And whilst it is kind of true, we also don't want to project that meaning, okay? Because if we project that meaning, whether it is harder or not is irrelevant, because now we just anticipate that it will be, and then we make things hard for ourselves. But when we have a little old thing called the unconditional loving witness, which we're going to get into, which is the compassion that we're talking about, this cannot happen, because the judgments we make doesn't mean that we are like disconnected from reality. Maybe like someone says something's wrong with our appearance or something like that, and we look in the mirror and it's like, oh wait, like actually I did have like something on my face, you know? Doesn't mean that their judgment of us is right, or that they should even be, you know, talking about how we look. But what it does mean is that we can still see the reality of how other people are seeing us. Or let's say someone says our breath smells, and it does actually smell, right? And then we want to use that as an excuse to, or not as an excuse, but as a guiding principle to correct something. But the judgment comes when we go, I'm a bad person for this. I'm wrong for this. I should be judged for this. I should have known better. I am not as good as other people because I made this mistake. I can't allow myself to make mistakes. I can just keep on going on and on and on, right? These are a lot of the same kind of things that my clients struggle with and their friends and all that kind of good stuff. But if we have the unconditional loving witness, where unconditionally we have compassion for ourselves and we have love for ourselves and we hold ourselves in a positive way, in a positive light, then that downward spiral is stopped before it begins. And then not only do we eliminate downward spirals, okay, what we also do is we automatically upward spiral, because that judgment like mechanic doesn't stop. Because if we want to look at the mind like senses, which is how I look at the mind, so there's taste, touch, smell, hearing, I can't believe I'm forgetting the other one. whatever, we'll get over it. I'm not the best tactile person, right? But there's the sixth one, which is minding, okay? Minding is like the mind is always going, I. This means this. It's a meaning-making machine. So that meaning-making machine, unless you get, an operation to turn your mind off, which is not something that I would recommend, unless you get that, then it's always going to be there, okay? And if it's always going to be there, then we might as well hack that system, that ecosystem, right? And how we do it is not through tactics, it's not through techniques, it's not like by trying to gaslight ourselves. We do it through this. We do it through the unconditional loving witness, okay? So, on command, instead of going into downward spirals, that same energy goes into upward spirals. More creative, more focused, more momentum. Also feels much better to be in an upward spiral too, which then adds to anything that we want to do, whether we want to be more productive, whether we want to stop procrastinating, whether we want to stay on a good habit or keep to that diet or whatever it is, we can do that. So your ideal self essentially stops being a fantasy and it becomes a reality. And also it will exceed your expectations too. Because if you've never really had access to, first of all, just not being in a downward spirals, like just getting triggered all the time, or even if you're not getting triggered all the time, because not everyone's there. In fact, most people watching this channel are not going to be like that. What we can do is once we eliminate that and then they're actually replaced by that same energy going upwards, a lot of the time when I work with clients and they go through this transformation, and it's not just like an overnight transformation, it usually takes a few months to really get going, then the expectations that they set out for themselves to begin with this kind of work, are just completely blown away. So, why is this a magic pill? Well, we experience everything through our mind, okay? And I might be looking over here a bit more than usual because I really want to get this analogy right because I took a lot of time to think about it. So our mind is like the glasses that we wear, okay? If those glasses let the full spectrum of light through, allow us to see clearly and ourselves with this, and also see ourselves with this clarity and light, then how we experience the world is through those glasses, okay? And that's basically our perspective. And our perspective is shaped by our ego wants, by our beliefs, our thinking patterns, and our awareness as a whole, right? But the opposite is also true in this analogy, because if we develop such a relationship where these glasses do not let all of the light through, that will also affect how we see the world, and not in a good way, okay? Because if our relationship with ourselves is negative, if it's always judgmental, if it's always harsh, if it's always, you should have done this, you should have done this, if it's anything like that, then you will see the world through that perspective, and that reality will be around you, and that reality will be more negative, it'll be more stressful, it will be more tension. There won't be as much happiness and fulfillment in your life, okay? And our relationship with ourselves is the building block of how we experience and co-create the world around us. We're not creating the world around us. The world is around us whether we want it to be or not, okay? That's the reality. But we are co-creating in it, because the world is essentially a canvas and we paint meaning onto it, right? That's why some people are afraid of spiders and some people aren't, because there's nothing inherent in the spider which is fearful, but some people have that genetic conditioning that spiders are venomous and some people don't, right? It's the meaning that we have painted on it, okay? So without a good relationship with ourselves, without the unconditional loving witness, we can't see clearly. Remember the glasses analogy? And because we can't see clearly, we'll stumble into negative spirals much, much easier. And in some cases, it can even make us put on different glasses which direct us into negative spirals. That's always a fun one, when there was not a negative spiral to stumble into anyway, but because our belief about something is so strong, we will try and fit that reality into anything. So story time from me is, I used to have a really big belief that everything that I wanted to do in life was just difficult. It was just hard. And that meant that I could play the underdog. That meant that I could get validation from myself from playing the underdog, so love, essentially. That meant that I could also have a fun hero's journey story, but you can only be an underdog for a certain period of time. You can't be like a perpetual underdog. So I had to give that up. But because my belief was so strong about that, like everything had to be hard, I made everything much more difficult. Business, dating and relationships, and jiu-jitsu competition, actually, quite a bit. So we don't want to do that, right? We don't want to put on glasses that are unnecessary. Instead, what we want to do is make sure that our perception of reality is set up in such a way, which means that we can just leverage success in the best and most effective way possible. So if one story wasn't enough, I got a few more for you, which is my own trials and tribulations. This was when I was in Thailand, okay, like a few years ago now. First time I was in Thailand, and the first few months were good, but then all of my friends left, and it was just me there because I wanted to stay there, focus on business, focus on building, all that kind of stuff. And I had so much uncertainty. You can probably relate, listen to this. There's probably a few times in your life where you felt a ton of uncertainty. And the biggest uncertainty for me was finances, because I was just starting the business on my own. I just come from working in social stage. If you guys want a bit more of a hero's journey version of me and how it can help you, I actually have a podcast mini series which I will put somewhere up here for you to click on with my friend and business owner and coach himself, Cameron. I highly recommend it when you have the time. It will also help you with getting through your trials and tribulations on your journey. But I had a lot of stuff around finances, I had a lot of stuff around loneliness, because it was my first time in this country. It was my first time on that continent, in that side of the world ever. And I didn't really know anyone, and I had to make things happen. That wasn't so much of an issue. Like, I was already pretty good socially at this point. Before I wasn't, but at this point I was pretty good. But it was just like all of the people who I had the deepest connections with were just not there anymore. And not only were they not there, they weren't even on the same continent as me. And I had a lot of questions, one of them being, was this really what I wanted to do? And one of my mentors, Sister Kama, died recently, alongside my nan, who was like a second parent to me. So I had a lot of grief and loss, and there was a lot of chaos around my internal world. And it made everything more uncertain. And if that wasn't enough to really paint the picture, essentially I was going through all of this, and it was so much things that like it could have been triggers for me. But because I had this practice, I was able to stop myself going into downward spirals, right? I was able to stop myself from falling in to the pit that was there. Because you can turn anything, especially when you have a lot of chaos in your internal world. Doesn't matter how successful you are externally, it just makes you much more reactive to things. And this was the practice which stopped me from being so reactive to that. Because I'd also lost, the company that I was working in, and then I'm a super social person by nature. It was super communal, felt like a real brotherhood, all of that kind of things, and it was just gone. So that was another really big, a big thing for me. This is, however, the reason why I bring this up is not just to tell a sob story about myself. It's because this is the first time where it really locked in this concept of being anti-fragile. Because like I said, I had all of this internal chaos, but because I had access to the unconditional loving witness, I didn't try and change how I felt. I didn't try and change my emotions. I didn't try and change my mental formations, my thoughts, right? I didn't try and change me. It doesn't mean that I wasn't reactive or adaptive or trying different things and trying to just get out there a bit more and get out of my own way. That's not what it means. What it means is I accepted myself precisely who I was all of the time. As the saying goes, warts and all, by Oliver Cromwell, who he in himself is a bit of a colourful character. And I just allowed myself to hold myself in unconditional love. And, I might put this here a second time because I really wanted to get this point across. It doesn't mean that you don't be agentive, right? Because a lot of the question comes up as soon as I start talking about this, especially with my clients that are more founders or people that are more in executive software engineering positions. They're like, oh, but isn't that going to make me soft? Am I going to lose my drive? Am I going to lose my motivation? No, because if you have true compassion, then you have access to inspiration all of the time. Motivation is something else, okay? And motivation is great. But motivation is short-lived. That's why you can't rely on it. Inspiration is like a limitless pool. Doesn't mean that things are going to be in la la land and it's going to be amazing and nothing's going to ever challenge you again. That's not what being anti-fragile is. by the way. It just means that you have a much deeper resource pool to pull from. So, whilst also being fulfilled and happy as well, in case that wasn't enough. I was still, because in this period, remember, I was still hustling hard. I was still getting the brand and the business up and running. I also did hundreds of free calls just to get my name out there. And it's helped me so much because self-compassion enables you to endure stress for longer. And when that stressful event is over, you bounce back much quicker. There's numerous studies on this, which means you get back on the horse quicker. And when you're actually going through a hard, challenging time, you are anti-fragile, like we're putting over here, right? You are anti-fragile, which is the exact place that we want to get to. So you become more resilient, more anti-fragile, and more dynamic simply by having a good relationship with yourself, an unconditionally loving relationship with yourself. However, just to do some housekeeping, if you're listening to this and the hairs on the back of your neck are a little bit up, I completely understand, because the people that you're thinking of, if you have a bit of a strange relationship with the concept of unconditional love, it's because they're transcending straight to love, okay? They're not integrating the rest of, whether you want to call it emotions, or some people will call it vibrations, some people will call it paradigms, levels of consciousness, whatever you want to call it, development of psychology, or development of your level of psychology. They're just trying to change how they feel, essentially. So unconditional love doesn't mean you feel love all of the time, right? Doesn't really have anything to do with emotion either, although the emotion is great. We don't want to disown emotions. It's the intention you have with yourself, the intention of being loving with yourself, the intention of compassion. We're going to get into the details of this later, I believe in part 7 of this, but that's essentially a prelude. We do not want to try and change how we feel, because you can't. You kind of can, but you can't, but you really can't, if that makes sense. You kind of can, but you really can't. What I mean by that is, like, if you try and not think of a pink elephant, you just think of a pink elephant, just boom, instantly. It's the same thing with emotions. If you try and push back on an emotion, it's just not going to, like, that's not how you can't outwork the emotion. The emotion is just there in response to your internal ecosystem, okay? I learned that the hard way when I was training for jiu-jitsu, or when I was doing, whenever I get into a competition, I try and not feel the emotion, and I just feel anxious 10 times more, okay? So we don't want to do that, which, like I was saying here, you just waste energy on resisting, is what you do. You're wasting energy on resisting an emotion, when really you can be just accepting it, saving that energy so you can be more empowered and use that to move forward in life towards your goals, whatever you want to do. So we need to look at how we can cultivate our own inner fire. What that means is inner strength. I see compassion and love as a fire. It's like an internal fire. It gives you so much inspiration, fulfillment, and drive and motivation. It's a very active emotion. Love is more like that. Compassion is kind of a more chilling. It's what I use with clients a lot of the time, or when I'm just with a friend and they need me to hold space for them. That's what compassion is better for. So one of the stories this brings to mind is one of my clients, and we'll call her Anissa. She was often in the business of disowning her own self-compassion and self-love for the name of others, right? Does that remind anyone of anyone? Maybe it does remind you of you, you know, because this is quite a common thing. It doesn't mean that, like, you're a people pleaser or anything like that. That can be something that happens, but we often are taught to disown our own standards for ourselves, or boundaries for ourselves, in the name of helping others, aren't we? It's just kind of how society works. Not that society isn't good or bad. It's just you're taught to sacrifice a bit more for the group, even in the Western cultures, where it's more individual. So this included things like not wanting to cause a scene. These are some of her concerns. Making others feel full, or fearing to rock the boat too much. So these are all good intentions, as we can see. They're all positive intentions. And this mainly showed up for her in her romantic relationships and how she handled being around her family. So romantic relationships and family. Friends, she seems super secure. The reason why I bring that up is because we don't want to brush or paint ourselves with, like, this absolutist monolith brush, do we? We want to see that just because we don't have an issue in one area, we can still have issues somewhere else. And just because we have issues in some areas doesn't mean that we're not good in this area, okay? We always want to meet the situation where it's at. And I think it's also important to know that she's quite a successful founder slash influencer. She's built a big audience. She's also taken a lot of risks. And all of the stuff she said that she wanted to do and be when she was a kid, she's actually done that, which is really nice. But it's still affecting her. So no amount of external whatever is going to stop that from happening if you have an issue with your internal state, with your internal ecosystem, with your relationship with yourself. And a big part of our work together in the program, the 24-week program, was this foundational principle of allowing us to have that relationship of unconditional love for ourselves. Because one of her big ones was getting into downward spirals. It was something would happen, super reactive to her emotions and states, including good states as well, because it happens both ways around, and then judgment. And that judgment would just, boom, make her go down for a couple of days. I mean, we're still working together now. Now those downward spirals are kind of just closed off for 1 or 2 days. When we first started working together, it was like a couple of weeks it would happen. So that was good progress. And when she first had this breakthrough on the call, it was like quite a shock for her, because instantly she was able to tell the people in her life that were not treating her with respect that that was not acceptable. And this culminated in the words, fuck off, right? I'm saying that because that inner fire, especially if it's been suppressed for a long time, can be a bit more like that. And that's perfectly fine, right? What I also said, when it starts to happen for you, when you hold yourself in compassion and strength or love, and you start realizing, wait, these people don't actually have, my best intentions at heart, or they just don't know, and I need to tell them. We do not want to say anything out of vindictiveness, or out of cruelty, or out of you hurt me, so I'll hurt you. Not because that's a wrong thing to feel. There's no moralizing here. It's because 6 months down the line, is that something that you'll regret? Or maybe you wanted to take more time and be considered. The impulse isn't bad. The impulse isn't wrong. We just want to integrate a bit of strategy into this, okay? That's very, very important. Strategy should never go out of the window. It should be integrated. It shouldn't be the be-all and end-all. It should be integrated. And it's important to note this kind of language, this kind of disagreeable language, because before, that kind of disagreeable language would have been too much for her. So good progress, right? And this came up to people who lied to her, right? And had some narcissistic tendencies. So this kind of language needs to be said. And it was also what's authentically coming up for her. If something's not authentically arising from you from a breakthrough, and you're just saying it because you think that's what you should say, that's cause to just kind of pause a bit. It should be authentically coming up, right? Which is why when the breakthrough happens, you need someone there who's going to hold that space for you and make sure that they also hold you accountable to yourself. So she was able to stand up for herself against people who she really, really struggled to do that with. Take up space, be strong in herself. Unconditional love, I definitely had a good time writing this. It's not all about hugging trees and being an enlightened pacifist monk all of the time. As we can see, having this actually makes us be more agentive, takes up more space, more room. Be a bit more aggressive. Aggression isn't bad if it's integrated. And this all comes from that relationship with yourself. And it means so far we've just talked about with downward spirals. We've just talked about the internal reality of it. There's also an external reality of downward spirals too. The external reality of downward spirals is that if somebody treats us in a certain way and sees that we don't defend ourselves or take up space, then they'll just keep treating us like that. So this can happen at work. Like I had another client, he's like works in corporate finance, and people would just make like a little bit of jokes at his expense, right? We worked on this along with some other kind of stuff, and the thing that they were making jokes about, he owned it. Like he had like a cosmetic surgery, a hair transplant, and someone was kind of giving him a hard time, and he just owned it. And he was like, "Yeah, I did." And the guy literally had no idea how to react, especially in those kind of bit more of a banter situation in corporate finance, where it's kind of like everyone's trying to be the big man, so to say, even the women, which is funny. They didn't know what to do with themselves. That's how strong this is. Because if he hadn't have addressed that externally, it would have just kept on downward spiraling. And the situation itself would have got worse and worse until you do something different, until you do something about it. Also, what happened from this space is, like I said, she's a founder. She was able to start creating again, authentically. There's still some kinks to work out for sure. I don't want to, oversell it or anything like that. But there was this inspiration that got activated again, where for weeks, I think actually months before, she didn't have any inspiration. So there's so many extra benefits that this is giving you. It doesn't just get you out of a downward spiral. It allows you to go into a creation, into an upward spiral. And to get this to metaphor really solidly here, what we want to do is want to see cultivating unconditional love is like cultivating a fire. Love is like a fire. It can be warm and it can nourish us and others, but it can also destroy and protect and embolden us. It can be used as a weapon too, a weapon of preservation. And like I said before, it's an intention. It's not a feeling. For some people, myself included when I first started, it's going to be hard to hold the feeling because it's just a feeling that you're not used to, especially if you're used to being in the paradigm of like being a founder or being somebody who's really has to crush it at a high level in work, like a software engineer or working in finance or something like that. Then this is not an emotion you're very accustomed to. You're usually used to the emotions of stress, of a little bit of fear and anxiety, excitement, frustration, anger. Those are the main ones, okay? Feelings are just fickle, okay? They're just a part of mind. I view mind and body as just a part of mind, okay? It's just one thing that's interconnected. And if we base our state on a subjective feeling that is fickle, we are setting ourselves up for failure, which is why it's not unconditional love we're feeling all of the time. It's unconditional love we're holding for ourselves all of the time. It's an intention. It's something which we bring with a real awareness on. Not a feeling. The feeling comes after. We have to do the work first, and then we get rewarded with the feeling and the state after, okay? So now we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of how to do this, and we're going to start with how we get rid of limiting beliefs, shadows, insecurities that hold us back from this just being our natural state, okay? We are not changing who we are. We are unlocking who we already were, but we just built so many layers over it. And if we could go back to the example of Anissa for a moment, if you have the patience, then we were also not just practicing this, but we're also rewiring her insecurities, her beliefs, right? To help her liberate some of the energy that was keeping her stuck in her blind spots and in her downward spirals. So classic insecurities, not just her, but in this example too. Am I wrong for this? Am I worthy for taking up this space? Sound familiar? Maybe it does for you. Will I abandon myself when I stand up for myself and end up in an even worse position than before? Damn, If these are your beliefs, then, it's not going to be a pleasant experience for you, which is why we want to get rid of those. So these are introjects that she learned from both her experiences of how she handled stuff like this before, but also from childhood and just other experiences, right? That's how we get introjections. We get introjections from lessons that we've taken from something external. They don't come intrinsically from us. They come from the external. They're not always bad. If we have, at some point when we saw a stove, we didn't know it was hot. We place our hand on it, it burns our hand. We have been introjected, the lesson has been introjected into us, and that's something hot and we don't want to touch it anymore. That's a very useful thing. But if somebody calls us ugly, somebody calls us lazy, if somebody is racist to us, if somebody is prejudiced towards us, if somebody is communicating that they don't like us, we can take any of these lessons into ourselves and make that a meaning about ourselves. It can be we are inferior. It can be fuck this person, I'm going to get my revenge. It can be something like, oh, I need to be careful around those people. It can be anything, but it's a limit, right? It's placing a limit on ourselves, like shackles on ourselves. and we need to give that back. So with Anissa, that's exactly what we did. On a one-on-one, we healed these interjects. We still got some more stuff to do, but even just looking at them with compassion and non-judgment is a relief in and of itself. Sometimes interjections take a bit longer. Sometimes they can be gone in a session. Sometimes it's something else, right? Sometimes it morphs into something else, and then the real problem shows itself. We have to be patient with ourselves here, okay? That's why all of my work is longer term, because we don't know. And like I said, we're working on this. She also had parts that didn't trust her, or to put it more accurately, were kind of scared. And we had to hold those insecurity and compassion too. And then what happened quite naturally, which is really, really encouraging, is the power projections were re-owned, and that's where the fire came from. So the reason why she was able to be disagreeable is because when we went in and did the unconscious work, healing the introjections, holding parts in compassion, what happened is projections, which is the third of the three musketeers of shadows and insecurities that we can have, is when we project our empowerment out into the world. And once we reclaim that, we become stronger and more robust and anti-fragile. And we suddenly realize we have the tools and the resources to own our space and own ourselves. This is the number one thing to clean up, okay, if you want to get out of downward spirals and unlock your ideal self. Because without this, you will always be at the mercy of your unconscious patterns, your subconscious beliefs, and your narratives about the world, which disempower you. Okay, that's just the reality. It was the same for me, which is why I have a free shadow work program where you'll be able to diagnose exactly your problem, and you'll be able to do some good healing work on that. It's 2.5 hours, covers everything. All it costs is your email. Also, when you sign up to my email, I don't spam. I just send them a couple of emails a week, all breakdowns of new insights I've been doing and all that kind of, and what I think could be helpful for you. So that's all it's going to cost. It's called The Most Practical Guide to Shadow Work on the Internet, the step-by-step guide on how to create meaningful and permanent change within yourself, your relationships, and your life as a whole. Go ahead and download it. It's completely free, super comprehensive. If you watch that, you will be able to at least get the first few steps of liberating yourself by yourself, okay? I put everything I know into that program. So here are the mechanics and the pitfalls to avoid behind holding compassion for yourself. There's 7 pillars, okay? There's somatic, there's affective, there's symbolic, there's relationship, there's cognitive, there's behavioral, and then they all come together and they become systemic, okay? This is detailed because you need to have detailed maps as well. But these are the 7 different modalities of therapy. It's a map that I actually got from one of my mentors, Kim Barton. And these are the so I take it as the 7 different ways we can hold compassion for ourselves. Like I touched on before, it's not just about feeling good or feeling compassionate for ourselves. It is having the intention, which covers everything, but I'll give you more granularity because I just wanted to include that for completion's sake. All 7 need to be hit for a complete overview. When I work one-on-one with somebody, obviously this is all taken care of, but you need to know all of this if you want to have the most compassionate relationship for yourself. So somatic is like a feeling, a sensorial based, okay? It's what's this breakthrough feel like? Is it light? Is it heavy? What color is it? It's getting into all of the 5 different senses of compassion. Affective is emotional. So the emotion of compassion, is that there? Symbolic, what symbols come up when you think of compassion or you hold yourself in compassion? Funny thing here, when I was working through, or when I did a big integration with my mentor, what came up through the polarities of humility and arrogance was like a 2-headed hydra. But then when they collapsed into each other, they became a 1-headed hydra. And that was my symbol for when I was doing my 24/7 practice to make sure that the insight was, really firmly held. You don't have to do a 24/7 practice. I just do that because this is my job and I want to do it. whenever I would lose that really chill confidence, which arose for me naturally in arrogance versus humility, the collapse of that polarity. Whenever I lost it, I would think of that two-headed hydra becoming one. Even when I think of it now, that experience comes up for me. That's how important and how powerful symbolic work can be. 4 is relationship to yourself. Are you holding the relationship of compassion for yourself? 5 is cognitive. Are your thoughts compassionate? Are you thinking in a compassionate way? You know. Then there's behavioral, which is, am I doing compassionate behaviors for myself? This is like boundary setting, by the way. Like I can be holding all of this kind of stuff, but if I'm not externally doing the behaviors of somebody who is compassionate or feeling compassion for themselves, then, you know, I'm in a tough spot. And then they all come together. 7 is systemic. Don't worry about that. This is already a system, okay? The reason why I include this is because at the start, it's going to be probably a bit difficult for you to hold all of these. I know I definitely couldn't before I had a mentor, and I worked on this for a while. So there's usually one door which is easier to open than the others. So you just go for that. Whichever one is easiest, somatic, affective, symbolic, relational, cognitive, behavioral, and systemic, you go for that one, okay? You stabilize that, and then you move on to the next while stabilizing the other one. Then as you get more solidly in this practice becomes more expansive, and you're integrating more breadth while continuing to go deep, okay? So meta meditation is the cornerstone of this practice. This develops the skill. Relationship is the frame. That's the way that we relate to this practice. It's not like a feeling-based practice. It's a relationship-based practice. So it stops us confusing ourselves what the objective is and what success is. The path of most resistance is the path. This is the direction we travel in and how we navigate hard situations for growth, okay? So before I get into the path of most resistance, meta meditation, I've done a ton of videos on this. Not actually, I've mentioned this a ton of different times, okay? So I'll go over it super quickly now. Meta meditation is developing the skill of having the state of something called metta. Metta is the Sanskrit and the Pali word from the Buddhist texts and also the Hindu text that means loving kindness. That's the state that we want to develop. And for that, I will link, or I will say, we start off by meditating like this. And the first thing that we try and bring up is images or symbols that bring us love. So that can be a baby, that can be our friend, that can be a platonic person in our life. There's no romantic stuff here, otherwise your your mind could get distracted by that. It's not a tantric practice. Something that gives you some kind of love. It can also be like a baby. So I say this story all the time. My mentor almost gave up on this practice when he first came to it because he couldn't find the emotion of love, basically. He couldn't find it in himself. He tried everything until he visualized baby elephants. And then that metta was able to come up. Whatever floats your boat, you get that going. So you start putting it in, you start coming into meditation and just seeing what's coming up. For me, for whatever reason, baby orangutans are coming up. And I just feel that loving kindness right here in my heart. Doesn't always have to be in your heart, okay? This is just what's coming up for me. Now that's stabilized, I radiate this metta to myself, this loving kindness to myself. And I say, may I be happy, may I be healthy, may I be safe, and may I be loved. Don't have to rush it, but you just keep on repeating that to yourself. 5 minutes. And for now, there's a meditation practice that comes after this. But you just do that, okay? I would recommend 15 to 30 minutes a day, if you can. Obviously, you know, everyone's got commitments. I'm not here to tell you need to do that, but that's essentially how you develop the skill of having the feeling come up, okay? And whenever you lose that feeling, you just gently bring up the images of baby orangutans like me. You just come up with that and then have that feeling stabilize, and you go back to repeating it to yourself, okay? Like I said, relationship is the frame. Don't need to go too much detail into that. What is the path of most resistance? This was given to me by my other big mentor, Pierre de Souza. And it's whatever's the most difficult. This is like actually complex, like a difficult thing to do. Like, let's say set up an email list, right? If you're not software inclined. The second is whatever's the most intimidating, which is like actually something that's like you're a bit intimidated by. So my example of somebody who works in corporate finance, he's actually a really strong character and a really assured character, very confident person. This is just something around the cosmetic surgery, he had a bit of fear around. Path of most resistance, holding compassion for yourself in that situation and owning, yeah, I did. And then the guy was like, oh, didn't really know what to say, which is what happens most of the time. Third is whatever's the most boring, which is, can I hold it? So the reason why I'm including this is your path of growth. Can you hold this compassion in whatever's the most complex, in whatever's the most intimidating, whatever's the most boring? So what do I mean by that? So the reason why this is really useful, this is what I use for everything, by the way. Whenever I'm learning a new skill, I use this as my compass to point me in the right direction. And whatever's the most difficult. So all of this, you want to tier a second layer on this, which is a red, yellow, green system. Which is red, these are situations where it's really tough for me to hold this. So you recognize that, and you can kind of hold this relationship with yourself in those situations for a bit of fun, for a challenge, but you don't have any like real expectation that this is something which you actually need to work on yet. Yellow is where there's some stress, there's some friction, but you do have the ability to push through and hold it. Might not always be perfect. That's your growth opportunity. Like I said, the guy who works not in fintech, in corporate finance, and he was kind of, people were kind of getting on his nerves a bit, and he needed to stand up for himself. That's like a yellow situation. That's a massive area of growth. And when you go through yellow long enough, suddenly the red zone where you can't do this starts to become yellow. And then green is just areas that you can do whenever you need to do. And here makes the entrance of the difference that makes the difference. Fast tracking progress is when it's going to come in. I will link my video here, which goes over this in detail. So go ahead and check that out. But essentially why we want to include this process is, I won't go into too much detail here because there's the video right there. We ask ourselves, what difference is this making to us? So it's not just enough. This is how crazy I am, right? It's not just enough that we're doing already a very effective practice to hold ourselves in unconditional love and eliminate self-doubt, downward spirals, and unlock our ideal self through this by going into upward spirals instead of downward spirals. We're also not just doing the practice, but making sure that our mind is on our side, that our mind is our ally. Because if we pay attention to the difference that everything is making, then we build up so many compounded small wins that they become massive wins. And that's the difference between micro and macro difference, because you're not always going to get a massive big change, especially if you're doing this on your own, to be honest with you. Like the guy who was working in, who was dealing with office politics in corporate finance, that's a big macro difference. He did that, and we did a few other stuff, and suddenly, he's seen as a leader in that area, and people don't disrespect him anymore. You're not always going to have that. There's going to be small differences. And if we don't pay attention to small differences, if we're used to being in the grind, set, hustle mode paradigm, which has its strengths and weaknesses, then we're not going to pay attention to that. And instead we're going to be like, oh, if I didn't win everything now, then I'm a loser. You might think that might be reasonable, but it's not. And here's why. Because if we are constantly telling ourselves we're a loser, we become basically like Sisyphus. Sisyphus is somebody in the Greek tragedies or the Greek legends who definitely has a bit of a tough, has a very tough draw of the stick in life, because what's happening to him is he's constantly having to he's going to have to push a boulder up a hill, and he's cursed that every time the boulder almost reaches the top of the hill, it just rolls back down and crushes him, and he has to push it up again, basically. That's what we're doing if we're always telling ourselves we're a loser, nothing's changed, and we just have to push even more. We have to instead pay attention to the difference. How do I feel different to last week? Oh, I might not be holding the unconditional love that much, but at least I'm having the intention. And what difference does that make to me? Well, that makes difference because it shows us progress and this isn't a finite game. So automatically more motivation and inspiration is coming. We have to always pay attention to the difference. Always. Do not think that not paying attention to the difference makes you harder working, because it doesn't, right? Just makes you more stressed. So an example of this, let's say you're an athlete after a competition. You would want to run the difference that makes the difference, which, just for completion's sake, is what difference is this making to me? What difference does this make to me? How does this difference affect me in the future when X triggering event from before happens again, because it will happen again? And what difference does knowing this make to me? So it's a step-by-step process to leverage the difference of everything, so that even the smallest difference can turn into something massive, okay? Like I said, go and watch that video. It explains it all in massive detail. See, if you're after a competition, regardless of what the result is, you want to say, how do I feel different, or what difference am I noticing compared to my last competition? So you can always find the positive in something. Positive reinforcement always wins long term. It doesn't mean that you disregard the results and you live in la la land, okay? No, you can see the results, see what you have to work on, be hungry for that stuff, hungry that you want to work on it, hungry that you want to change something. But you also are still putting yourself into an upward spiral. Can you think about that for a moment? You're in an upward spiral while still having the same hunger that you had in a grinding mode. That's when you become just unstoppable, okay? The macro version of this is having difference and seeing difference switched on all of the time. This permanently rewires your RAS, your reticular activation system. What your reticular activation system is essentially your spotlight of consciousness, okay? We have a lot of things happening inside of us, but we only have a certain spotlight of awareness. As you go through the levels of maturity in developmental psychology, that spotlight becomes more and more expansive, so we can hold much, 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 much more. Which is why the growing up part of integral theory is so, so important. But we can do this a bit more, handheld by having difference making switched on all of the time, okay? Like I said, I go into it in super big detail in my video on it, so go ahead and check that out. Little story time is, recently I had a client that really struggled with staying consistent and disciplined when it comes to a couple of areas of life. We'll call him Andreas. I like that name. It's my second name. For him, it was around socializing, dating, and relationships. So anything in the social paradigm, okay? So even when it was just conversations in the gym, or in a coffee shop, just like people he wanted to banter around with or meet, because he's living in a kind of a digital nomad hub. He wants to get out there, he wants to network, all that kind of stuff. Or when it's speaking with a woman he's interested in, it felt like he couldn't be himself, or he himself wasn't enough and he had to perform, basically. He wanted to say more, express more, but he just felt stifled. And then after a week of being consistent with certain social freedom challenges and relaxation exercises, and also some deep shadow work sessions that we're doing in the one-on-one mentorship with him, Andreas has been able to consistently show up in all areas of life here. It's actually how we found a mutual friend between us, because like I said, he's living in a digital nomad hub. I'm a digital nomad, but I'm not really living there at the moment. They just happened to randomly struck up a conversation and in the gym, and they both knew me, basically. But then we took it to the next level, and we ran a difference that makes the difference process, fused with split ego state work, head, heart, and gut process. I also have a video on that too. Voice dialoguing and evolution of shadow resolution all into one. And what emerged for him after this 45-minute process was a newfound consistency that was a massive level of certainty, trust, and appreciation of himself on another level that he'd ever experienced before. Which made all of these challenges, which by the way are still challenges, right? Challenges are not going to go away overnight necessarily. They can, but we can't expect that. Because if we expect that and it doesn't happen, then we think it's a failure. It made all of these challenges much more simple, straightforward, and easy. And now all of this social exercises that I had him doing, which he wasn't able to do at all during 1 week, he's now been doing it consistently every single day in the few weeks that now we've been really working on it. And we were able to also, it wasn't just that he was able to do the same exercises, that whole time we've been increasing the path of most resistance. So it's been getting higher and he's harder, and he's been rising to the challenge every single time. And that leads to faster progress and breakthroughs, which we are all about. So your action protocols for today, ladies and gentlemen, is metta meditation, 30 minutes a day. You can start off with 15. Anything less than that probably isn't worth it. Download my shadow work program to heal anything blocking having this relationship with yourself and also unlocking your ideal self. Path of most resistance with journaling and categorization. That means listing out the activities which is most difficult, most intimidating, most boring, and then categorizing them into red, yellow, green. Action taking, okay, because don't just keep on mentally masturbating, actually go out there and action take. Difference that makes the difference throughout this entire process. This helps you achieve your ideal self much faster and eliminate downward spirals. Use the comments here to ask questions or my email to get personalized feedback and course corrections. 7, have patience, gratitude, and compassion for yourself throughout all of this. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. I'll see you on the next one.